First contact. Dr. Sarah Chen stared through the quantum microscope at what appeared to be an impossibility. The alien cell structure before her defied everything she knew about biology, yet here it was, pulsing with life in her lab aboard the international science vessel Hawking. "Are you seeing this?" she whispered to Dr. Sarah Valois, the Centaurian xenobiologist standing beside her. The tall, silver-skinned being's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of intense interest in their species. "Fascinating." Sarah breathed, their melodic voice carrying a hint of excitement. The Arcturus samples show perfect symmetry in their reproductive cells. Single-strand hereditary patterns, no biological redundancy. "It's elegant." Sarah straightened, her back protesting after hours hunched over the microscope. The specimen they were studying came from the newly discovered Arcturus civilization, a species that had reached out to Earth just 6 months ago with an unusual proposal. They wanted to study human genetics. The research vessel had been dispatched to the edge of Arcturus space as part of the first scientific exchange between their species. What they'd found had turned everything they knew about evolution on its head. "But it doesn't make sense," Sarah said, pulling up the holographic comparison between human and Arcturian DNA. "Every complex species we've ever studied has some form of genetic redundancy. It's a fundamental principle of evolution. Backup systems prevent fatal mutations. How did they evolve without it?" Sarah's silver fingers danced across the holographic controls, highlighting various cellular structures. "Perhaps that is why they're so interested in humans. Your species has the highest degree of genetic redundancy we've ever documented." The Arcturus must have noticed this in their preliminary studies. Sarah was about to respond when the lab's communication panel chimed. "Dr. Chen, Dr. Valois," Captain Rodriguez's voice came through. "Our Arcturus hosts are requesting your presence in the main conference room. They say they've made a breakthrough." The walk to the conference room felt longer than usual. The Hawking was a state-of-the-art research vessel, but it was still cramped by deep space standards. Sarah used the time to organize her thoughts. After 3 weeks of collaborative research, they'd learned that the Arcturus were technological marvels but biological minimalists. Every aspect of their physiology was streamlined, efficient, and singular in purpose. The conference room doors slid open to reveal 3 Arcturus scientists. They were tall, slender beings with iridescent skin that seemed to shift colors with their movements. Each had a single large eye that dominated their smooth, oval faces. What fascinated Sarah most was how identical they appeared. Not just similar, but exactly the same. Dr. First, as they had asked to be called, stepped forward. Their eye pulsed with a soft blue light, their equivalent of a smile. "Dr. Chen, Dr. Valois, thank you for coming. We believe we have understood something fundamental about human evolution that explains everything." Sarah noticed the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The other 2 Arcturus scientists moved to the display wall, bringing up a complex series of genetic maps. "Your species," Dr. First continued, "evolved on a planet with high radiation levels and frequent natural disasters. This led to the development of redundant systems. 2 kidneys, 2 lungs, 2 reproductive organs. But what fascinates us most is your brain structure." The display shifted to show a human neural map alongside an Arcturus one. The difference was striking. Where the Arcturus brain showed clean, precise neural pathways, the human brain was a chaos of interconnected networks, multiple pathways leading to the same destinations. "We evolved in a stable system," Dr. First explained. "Our world knew no catastrophes, no sudden changes. We adapted through precision. Humans adapted through redundancy and chaos. This is why we sought you out. We believe our species can learn from each other in ways we never imagined." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What exactly are you proposing?" Dr. First's eye shifted to a deep purple. "We want to understand how to introduce controlled redundancy into our genome. Our population is dying, Dr. Chen. We can no longer adapt to even minor environmental changes. We need humanity's chaos to survive." The implications hit Sarah like a physical force. This wasn't just about scientific curiosity. It was about survival. The Arcturists weren't just studying them. They were hoping to find a way to save their entire species. But introducing genetic redundancy to a species that evolved without it, Sarah began, could be catastrophic. Xera finished, their 4 eyes now fixed on the genetic displays. The cellular stress alone could. We are aware of the risks, Dr. First interrupted. But we have no choice. Our predictions show our species will become non-viable within 3 generations. We need your help, Dr. Chen. We need humanity's beautiful chaos. Sarah looked at the genetic displays again, seeing them with new eyes. What had started as a simple scientific exchange had become something far more profound. The next few months would determine not just the future of scientific understanding, but the survival of an entire civilization. As she stared at the interweaving patterns of human DNA alongside the elegant simplicity of Arcturus genetics, Sarah couldn't help but wonder. Had evolution led humanity down a messy path for exactly this moment? Were all those redundant systems not just about survival, but about having something vital to share with the cosmos? The weight of that responsibility settled over the conference room like a heavy blanket. Their work was no longer just research. It was a race against time to save a species that had evolved too perfectly for their own good. "We'll help," Sarah said finally, her voice firm. "But we'll need to establish new protocols. If we're going to attempt genetic modification on this scale, we need to be certain we don't make things worse." Dr. First's eye pulsed with relief. "Thank you, Dr. Chen. We knew humanity would understand. After all, your species knows better than any other that sometimes the most beautiful solutions come from imperfection." As Sarah left the conference room that day, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Humanity's messy evolution might hold the key to saving the Arcturus, but what other secrets lay hidden in the chaos of human DNA? What other species might need humanity's unique genetic inheritance? The universe, it seemed, had a sense of irony. All those redundant systems that had seemed so inefficient compared to the Arcturus's elegant design were exactly what made humans valuable to the galaxy. Sometimes, Sarah realized, the most important adaptations weren't about being perfect. They were about being perfectly imperfect. Calculated risks. The holographic model of the Arcturus genome rotated slowly in the center of the laboratory, its single-strand structure gleaming like a twisted silver thread. Dr. Sarah Chen had spent the last 3 weeks staring at this display, trying to find a way to introduce genetic redundancy without destroying the elegant efficiency that had defined the species for millions of years. "The simulation failed again," she announced, her voice tight with frustration. The latest attempt to modify the Arcturus genetic structure had resulted in cellular collapse within minutes. It was their 47th failure. Dr. First's eye pulsed with a deep orange, their species' expression of concern. "Perhaps we should consider a different approach. Our previous attempts focused on modifying existing structures. What if we instead tried to add new ones?" The suggestion made Sarah pause. She'd been so focused on altering the Arcturus's existing genetic framework that she hadn't considered building entirely new systems. It was risky, essentially adding new chapters to a book that had been perfectly edited for millennia. Xera, who had been quietly analyzing data in the corner, looked up. "The human appendix," they said suddenly. "What about it?" Sarah asked, turning to face her Centaurian colleague. "It's vestigial, no longer necessary for survival, yet it remains. What if we created similar backup structures in the Arcturus physiology? Not critical systems, but auxiliary ones that could evolve into redundancies over time." Dr. First's eye shifted to a brilliant green, their equivalent of excitement. Yes, our bodies would be more likely to accept structures that don't immediately interfere with essential functions. Sarah quickly pulled up the human genome map alongside the Arcturus display. "We could start with something simple. What about blood cell production? Humans have multiple sites where this occurs, but the Arcturus only have one." The next 12 hours passed in a blur of calculations and simulations. They identified 3 potential sites in the Arcturus physiology, where secondary blood-forming tissue could be introduced with minimal risk. The genetic modifications would be subtle, just enough to create the potential for redundancy without forcing it. But as they prepared for their first real test, an alarm blared through the ship. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom. "Dr. Chen, Dr. Valboy, report to the bridge immediately." When they arrived, the bridge was a flurry of activity. On the main screen, a massive solar flare erupted from the nearby star, sending waves of radiation toward their position. "The Arcturus shielding technology is failing," the captain explained grimly. "Their entire station is about to be exposed to lethal levels of radiation. We need to evacuate them to the Hawking immediately." Sarah felt her blood run cold. The Arcturus's perfect evolution had left them exceptionally vulnerable to radiation. Their single-strand DNA would shatter under such exposure. Without redundant systems to repair the damage, even minimal exposure could be fatal. "How many can we accommodate?" she asked. "Maybe 30, Rodriguez replied. "There are over 200 on their station." Dr. First, who had followed them to the bridge, spoke up. "We have already begun evacuation procedures to our emergency shelters, but our shielding will only hold for approximately 6 hours. After that." Sarah looked at the genetic model still floating on her tablet. "What if we didn't wait? What if we implemented the modifications now?" "That's incredibly dangerous," Sarah warned. "We haven't even run a complete simulation." "But the radiation might actually help," Sarah insisted, her mind racing. "Human DNA repair mechanisms evolved specifically to deal with radiation damage. If we can introduce even a basic version of these systems, the risk of cellular collapse would be extreme." Dr. First said, their eye pulsing rapidly between colors. "More extreme than certain death from radiation exposure." Sarah countered. She turned to Captain Rodriguez. "How long until the radiation hits?" 4 hours, 17 minutes. Sarah took a deep breath. "Then we have 4 hours to prepare the procedure. We can use the radiation itself as a catalyst for the genetic modifications. It's dangerous, yes, but it might be their only chance." The next few hours were a desperate race against time. Sarah and her team worked frantically to refine their genetic modification procedure, while the Arcturus evacuated as many of their people as possible to the shielded emergency shelters. Those who couldn't fit would be their test subjects, volunteers who faced death either way. As the radiation wave approached, 43 Arcturus remained on their station, each having agreed to undergo the experimental procedure. Sarah had never performed genetic modification on this scale, and never under such time pressure. "The process will be painful," she warned them as her team prepared the injection sequence. "Your bodies will be fighting against millions of years of evolution." One of the volunteers, their eye a calm blue, responded, "Pain is preferable to extinction. Dr. Chen, we trust in humanity's chaos." The radiation wave hit just as they administered the last injection. Sarah watched through the observation window as the Arcturus writhed in their medical pods, their iridescent skin flickering with colors she'd never seen before. Their single-strand DNA was being bombarded by radiation, while simultaneously trying to incorporate the new genetic material. For 3 terrifying hours, the fate of 43 lives hung in the balance. The Arcturus's vital signs fluctuated wildly as their bodies either accepted or rejected the modifications. Some flatlined temporarily before surging back to life, their systems struggling to adapt to the new genetic framework. And then, gradually, the readings began to stabilize. One by one, the Arcturus started showing signs of successful genetic incorporation. Their bodies were learning to repair radiation damage using the new redundant systems. When the radiation wave passed, 39 of the 43 volunteers had survived. Their genetic structure had been forever altered, but they were alive. More importantly, preliminary scans showed that the modifications were stable and potentially heritable. As Sarah helped the survivors out of their pods, she noticed something extraordinary. Their eyes, once uniform in color, now showed subtle variations. It was the first sign of the genetic diversity they had hoped to introduce. Dr. First, who had insisted on staying to oversee the procedure, approached her. Their eye now shimmered with multiple colors simultaneously, something Sarah had never seen before. "We owe humanity a debt we can never repay," they said softly. "You have given us more than survival. You have given us the chance to evolve again." Sarah watched as the survivors embraced each other, their skin rippling with new patterns and colors. They had taken the first step toward a more resilient future, but she knew their journey was far from over. The real challenge would be helping the Arcturus navigate the path between perfect order and necessary chaos. As she began documenting the procedure for future reference, Sarah couldn't help but smile at the irony. Sometimes it took a brush with extinction to appreciate the beauty of imperfection. Ripple effects. 6 months after the radiation crisis, the Arcturus homeworld's capital city of Unity buzzed with unprecedented activity. Dr. Sarah Chen stood before the World Council, presenting the latest data on the modified survivors, now known as the adaptives. "The genetic changes have stabilized beyond our initial projections," she explained, gesturing to the holographic displays. "The secondary systems we introduced aren't just surviving. They're thriving. More importantly, they're evolving." The council chamber, a vast circular room with crystalline walls that usually reflected the Arcturus's characteristic uniformity, now showed subtle variations in color as the council members processed this information. Their traditional single-color eye patterns had begun showing multiple hues, a physical manifestation of their growing diversity. First speaker Ven, their eyes swirling with green and purple, leaned forward. "But these changes go beyond mere physical redundancy, don't they, Dr. Chen?" Sarah nodded. "The introduction of redundant systems has triggered unexpected neurological development. The adaptives are showing increased creativity, enhanced problem-solving abilities, and most surprisingly, stronger emotional responses." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Emotion had always been present in Arcturus society, but it had been controlled, predictable. The adaptives were experiencing feelings with an intensity that matched their new biological complexity. Dr. First, now serving as lead researcher on the adaptive study, stepped forward. Their eye displayed a kaleidoscope of colors that would have been impossible 6 months ago. "Our perfect evolution had become our prison," they said, their voice carrying new depths of resonance. "We had reached the end of our development. The redundancy we feared as inefficient has awakened parts of ourselves we never knew existed." But not everyone saw these changes as positive. Council member Thex, one of the most conservative voices in Arcturus leadership, raised their concerns. "These modifications have introduced chaos into our society. The adaptives no longer think or behave in predictable patterns. Some are even questioning our most fundamental traditions." They weren't wrong. Sarah had watched as the modified Arcturus began challenging centuries-old customs. The society's rigid hierarchical structure, based on the principle of perfect uniformity, was beginning to crack. Change was inevitable. Sarah countered, "Your species faced extinction. The question now is how to manage this transition in a way that preserves what's valuable about your culture while embracing necessary evolution." The debate continued for hours, but Sarah's attention was drawn to the public gallery. Hundreds of unmodified Arcturus had gathered to observe the proceedings, and many showed signs of the subtle color variations that indicated they'd begun the early stages of genetic therapy. The treatment program had been voluntary, but more Arcturus were choosing to undergo the modifications each day. They'd seen how the adaptives had not just survived the radiation crisis, but emerged stronger. More than that, they'd witnessed the awakening of new possibilities in their modified brethren. After the council session, Sarah met with a group of adaptive children, the first generation born with the modified genetics. They were a striking sight, their eyes constantly shifting colors, their movements more fluid and spontaneous than traditional Arcturus youth. "Watch this," one child said excitedly, concentrating until their skin displayed a complex pattern of swirling colors. Such fine control over their chromatic responses had never been possible before. The redundant systems had given them not just survival advantages, but new forms of expression. Later that evening, Sarah sat in her temporary quarters, reviewing her notes. Dr. First joined her, bringing a sample of traditional Arcturus tea, though they'd recently begun experimenting with adding new flavors to the ancient recipe. We received the latest reports from our deep space outposts. They said, their eyes settling into a peaceful blue-green pattern. 3 new colonies have reported successful adaptations to their local environments. Before the modifications, we could only establish settlements on worlds nearly identical to our homeworld. Sarah smiled. Your species is learning to bend instead of break. It's exactly what we hoped for. But there are complications you didn't anticipate, Dr. First noted. The emotional awakening, the social upheaval. Some say we're losing our identity as a species. Or maybe you're finding it, Sarah suggested. Perfect uniformity isn't natural. Even identical twins on Earth develop distinct personalities. Diversity makes a species stronger. Dr. First was quiet for a moment, their eyes shifting through thoughtful patterns. We've begun seeing the emergence of art in our society. Real art, not just the mathematical patterns we use to create. The adaptives are writing poetry, composing music. They're dreaming, Dr. Chen. Actually dreaming. The implications were staggering. The Arcturus were not just surviving. They were transforming into something entirely new while still remaining uniquely themselves. It was evolution in real time, guided by science, but driven by the inherent adaptability they'd inherited from human DNA. There's something else, Dr. First added, their eye pulsing with excitement. We've detected the first signs of natural genetic drift in the adaptive population. Small mutations, beneficial ones. Our species has begun evolving on its own again. Sarah felt a profound sense of satisfaction. They had given the Arcturus the tools for survival, but the species was charting its own course forward. The perfect symmetry of their past was giving way to a future of beautiful imperfection. As she looked out her window at the capital city, Sarah could see the changes reflected in the architecture. New buildings were appearing with organic curves and asymmetrical designs, standing in stark contrast to the rigid geometric patterns of the past. It was a physical manifestation of the transformation taking place in Arcturus society, a movement from perfect order to dynamic harmony. The universe, it seemed, had a preference for diversity. In saving the Arcturus from extinction, humanity had helped them rediscover a fundamental truth. True resilience comes not from perfection, but from the ability to adapt, to change, and sometimes to embrace the chaos that leads to growth. Divergence. The first protest in Arcturus history began quietly. Dr. Sarah Chen watched from her laboratory as thousands of unmodified Arcturus gathered outside the central research complex, their eyes pulsing in perfect synchronization, a display of unity that was becoming increasingly rare in their changing society. They called themselves the purists, and they demanded an immediate halt to all genetic modifications. Their leader, former council member Thex, stood at the forefront, their eye maintaining a steady, unwavering red. Our perfection was not a prison. Thex's voice carried across the crowd. It was our strength. These modifications are corrupting the very essence of who we are. Inside the complex, Sarah and Dr. First monitored the situation while reviewing the latest data from their long-term study. The results were startling. The adaptives weren't just developing new biological capabilities. They were beginning to form distinct subgroups based on how their bodies had interpreted and adapted the genetic modifications. Look at this. Sarah pointed to a neural scan. This group has developed enhanced synaptic pathways in their visual cortex. They're seeing colors that don't even exist in their normal spectrum. And this group here, their cellular regeneration rate is triple what we initially engineered. Dr. First's eyes swirled with contemplative blues and greens. Evolution is no longer theoretical for us. We're watching it happen in real time, within a single generation. But Thex isn't entirely wrong. We are becoming something different. The protest outside grew larger as the day progressed. The purists' message resonated with those who feared the rapid changes in their society. The traditional Arcturus value of uniformity was being challenged not just culturally, but biologically. A young adaptive researcher burst into the lab, their eye flickering with urgent patterns. "You need to see this," they said, bringing up a holographic display. "We've detected something unexpected in the latest generation of modified children." The data showed that some of the children had developed rudimentary secondary neural clusters, primitive backup brains. It was an adaptation none of their simulations had predicted, a spontaneous evolution sparked by the introduction of redundancy into their genetic code. "This is beyond anything we anticipated," Sarah breathed, studying the scans. "Their bodies aren't just accepting redundancy, they're actively seeking it out, finding new ways to implement it." The implications were enormous. The Arcturus were not simply becoming more resilient. They were fundamentally reimagining what their species could be. Each new generation brought unexpected developments, some subtle, others profound. But with these changes came new challenges. The adaptives were developing distinct personalities, individual preferences, and even opposing viewpoints, concepts that had been virtually unknown in their society. The perfect consensus that had governed their civilization for millennia was breaking down. Reports began coming in from various colonies. Some adaptive groups were developing unique cultural practices, their new biological capabilities influencing everything from art to architecture. Others were pushing the boundaries of space exploration, their enhanced resilience allowing them to survive in environments that would have been lethal to their unmodified ancestors. The division between modified and unmodified Arcturus grew more pronounced. Families found themselves split, with some members embracing change while others clung to tradition. The purists began establishing isolated communities, attempting to preserve their original genetic purity. Sarah found herself at the center of this evolutionary storm. She had given the Arcturus the tools for survival, but she hadn't fully anticipated how those tools would reshape their entire civilization. Late one night, as she reviewed the latest data, she received an urgent message from the World Council. A group of radical purists had taken control of a genetic research facility in the Southern Hemisphere. They were demanding access to the original genetic templates, claiming they could reverse the modifications. "It's impossible," Dr. First said when they heard the news. "The changes have become too deeply integrated. Attempting to reverse them would be fatal." But the incident highlighted a growing crisis. The Arcturus were facing not just a biological evolution, but a philosophical one. They had to decide what kind of species they wanted to become. In response to the crisis, a new movement emerged among the adaptives. They called themselves the synthesists, advocating for a middle path that would preserve the best aspects of their traditional culture while embracing their new potential. Dr. First, who had become one of the leading voices of the synthesis movement, addressed an assembly of both modified and unmodified Arcturus. "Our perfection was not wrong, but it was incomplete. Through these changes, we have not lost our identity. We have expanded it. We are becoming not less Arcturus, but more." As Sarah listened to the speech, she noticed something remarkable. The crowd's eye patterns, while diverse, had begun pulsing in harmony, not the rigid synchronization of the past, but a complex, interweaving pattern that somehow maintained unity while celebrating difference. It was evolution in action, not just in their genes, but in their very concept of identity. The Arcturus were learning that strength could come from diversity, that adaptability didn't mean losing oneself, but becoming more fully what one was meant to be. That evening, Sarah added a new entry to her research log. Perhaps the most profound change isn't in their DNA at all. It's in their understanding of what it means to be perfect. They're learning that true perfection isn't a fixed state, but the ability to grow, to change, and to become more than what you were, while still remaining fundamentally yourself. Cosmic implications. The Galactic Council's emergency session, marked the first time in recorded history that every spacefaring civilization had gathered in one place. Dr. Sarah Chen stood before representatives of 27 species, each watching with varying degrees of concern as she presented the Arcturus transformation data. The rate of change is unprecedented. A Proximan delegate chittered through their translator. An entire species reorganizing its genetic structure within a single generation. The implications are disturbing. The massive chamber, carved from an asteroid in neutral space, hummed with tense energy. The Arcturus had been respected throughout the galaxy for their stability and predictability. Their sudden transformation had sent shockwaves through interstellar politics. Several species have already requested access to the modification protocols, Sarah explained, bringing up a galactic map dotted with highlighted worlds. Many face similar evolutionary dead ends as the Arcturus did. The Centaurian representative, a colleague of Sarah's, raised all four hands in alarm. You cannot seriously be considering sharing this technology. The potential for misuse is enormous. Dr. First, now serving as the Arcturus ambassador, stepped forward. Their eye displayed a complex pattern that would have been impossible a year ago. We understand your fears. We lived in fear of change for millennia. But look at what we've become. The holographic displays showed the latest data from the Arcturus colonies. Worlds that had been marginally habitable were now thriving with adapted populations. The modified Arcturus had developed specialized traits for each environment while maintaining their core identity. But it was the cultural data that truly captured the Council's attention. Arcturus art, music, and literature had exploded into the galaxy. Their new perspectives on unity through diversity had begun influencing other species' philosophical discussions. There's something else, Sarah said, bringing up a new dataset. We've detected quantum entanglement patterns in the neural networks of modified Arcturus children. They're developing a form of telepathic communication we don't yet understand. The chamber erupted in concerned murmurs. Several delegates called for immediate containment protocols. Others demanded access to the modification technology for their own species. Sarah watched as the Galactic Council descended into chaos, a fitting metaphor for what they feared. But beneath their panic, she sensed something else. Hope. Species that had been trapped by their own evolution saw a possibility for change. A Syrian elder, their crystalline form refracting light across the chamber, spoke with ancient wisdom. Perhaps this is why humanity was allowed to join the galactic community, not for their technology or their resources, but for their understanding of change itself. That evening, in a private meeting with the human delegation, Sarah reviewed the latest requests for genetic modification assistance. Dozens of species faced similar challenges to the Arcturus, perfect adaptation to their original environments, leaving them vulnerable to change. We need to establish guidelines. Admiral Chen, Sarah's mother and Earth's representative to the Council, said firmly, we can't just reshape the galaxy's genetic landscape without understanding the consequences. Sarah pulled up the latest images from the Arcturus homeworld. The once uniform cities now displayed an organic beauty, with structures that adapted to their inhabitants' needs. The consequences are already here. The question is whether we help guide this change, or let it happen chaotically. The decision came 3 days later. The Galactic Council established the Evolutionary Advisory Committee, with Earth and the Arcturus as joint chairs. They would oversee all genetic modification requests, ensuring that species maintain their essential nature while gaining the ability to adapt. But as Sarah prepared to leave the Council station, she received an urgent message from Dr. First. The quantum entanglement patterns in Arcturus children had evolved. They weren't just communicating with each other. They were beginning to perceive quantum information from the universe itself. We're receiving images. Dr. First's message read, their usual composure shaken. The children are seeing other dimensions, other possibilities. Sarah, I believe we've done more than save our species. We've opened a door to something vast. The implications staggered her. The Arcturus transformation wasn't just about survival or evolution. It was about expanding the very boundaries of what life could be. Their journey from perfect stasis to dynamic change had led them to the threshold of cosmic consciousness. As her ship prepared for departure, Sarah looked out at the glittering expanse of the galaxy. Somewhere out there, Arcturus children were dreaming in quantum frequencies, their minds touching realities humans had only theorized about. They had given the Arcturus the gift of chaos, and in return, the Arcturus were showing them the hidden patterns in that chaos. The universe, it seemed, had been waiting for this moment, when the precision of the Arcturus would merge with human adaptability to unlock new frontiers of existence. The next chapter in cosmic evolution was beginning, and no one could predict where it would lead. Full circle. 5 years after the first genetic modifications, Dr. Sarah Chen stood in the observation dome of the new Arcturus Human Research Institute, watching as a group of modified children played in the quantum gardens below. Their skin rippled with colors that corresponded to the quantum fluctuations they perceived, creating living art that bridged the visible and invisible worlds. Dr. First approached, their eye now displaying patterns so complex they seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The Synthesis Council has approved the next phase, they said. We're ready to begin incorporating the quantum perception abilities into the modification protocols for other species. The decision hadn't come easily. After the Arcturus children's quantum abilities had emerged, numerous species had demanded immediate access to the modification technology. But the Arcturus, having learned the value of careful evolution, insisted on a gradual approach. How are the purists responding? Sarah asked, thinking of the isolated communities that still maintain their original genetic structure. Something unexpected has happened, Dr. First replied. Their children are beginning to show signs of spontaneous modification. It seems the presence of quantum-aware individuals is triggering natural evolutionary responses in unmodified populations. The universe, they had discovered, had its own plans for evolution. The introduction of human genetic chaos into the perfect Arcturus system hadn't just changed one species, it had created a cascade effect that was reshaping the fundamental relationship between consciousness and reality. Sarah's research team had documented over 300 new abilities in the modified Arcturus population. Some could perceive dark matter currents. Others had developed symbiotic relationships with quantum fields, using them to enhance their cognitive processes. The most gifted children could even manipulate space-time on a microscopic scale. But the most profound change was philosophical. The Arcturus had moved beyond their binary understanding of perfection and chaos. They had discovered that true evolution wasn't about becoming more complex or more efficient. It was about becoming more aware of the infinite possibilities that existed in every moment. We've received a message from the Proximate colonies, Dr. First continued. Their first group of modified children has begun showing signs of quantum awareness, but it's manifesting differently. They're perceiving temporal rather than spatial dimensions. Sarah nodded, unsurprised. Each species that underwent modification expressed quantum consciousness in unique ways, reflecting their evolutionary history and cultural identity. The galaxy was becoming a tapestry of diverse perspectives on reality itself. The Galactic Council, initially fearful of these changes, had been transformed by them. Species that had been locked in ancient rivalries found new grounds for cooperation as they shared their unique perceptions of the universe. The quantum awareness spreading through modified populations had revealed that consciousness itself was a fundamental force in the cosmos, as important as gravity or electromagnetism. A group of children in the garden below had begun a new game, using their quantum perception to weave patterns in probability fields. The effects rippled through higher dimensions, creating harmonies that only they could fully perceive, but that everyone could feel. We're ready for the final step, Dr. First said softly. The children want to show you what they've discovered. In the center of the quantum garden, the most gifted of the Arcturus children had gathered. As Sarah watched, they began to synchronize their consciousness, not in the rigid patterns of their ancestors, but in a flowing dance of quantum possibilities. Through their shared perception, they revealed what they had found. The universe was alive, not just with matter and energy, but with consciousness itself. Every particle, every wave, every quantum fluctuation was part of a vast, aware cosmos that had been waiting for life to evolve enough to perceive it. The perfect evolution of the Arcturus and the adaptive chaos of humanity had been necessary components of a larger pattern. By combining them, they had created a key that unlocked new levels of cosmic awareness. As the children's demonstration ended, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion. The crisis that had brought her to the Arcturus station years ago hadn't just been about saving a species. It had been about opening a door that the universe itself had been preparing for eons. Dr. First's eyes shimmered with colors that seemed to echo the quantum patterns still lingering in the garden. "What do you think happens next?" Sarah smiled, watching as another group of children began their own quantum exploration. "I think we've only seen the beginning. Every new generation will discover something we never imagined possible. The real question isn't what happens next. It's whether we're ready to keep evolving with them." Above them, the stars seemed to pulse with new meaning, as if responding to the growing consciousness that had begun to perceive their deeper nature. The perfect symmetry of the past and the beautiful chaos of change had finally found their balance, not in stability, but in endless, purposeful evolution. The universe, it turned out, had been playing a very long game. And humanity's gift of imperfection had been the final piece in a puzzle that stretched across galaxies and eons, a puzzle that was really just the first step in a much greater journey. As Sarah made her final notes in the research log that had documented this remarkable journey, she wrote, "Perhaps this was always our destiny, not to perfect ourselves, but to help the universe wake up to its own infinite possibilities. In the end, the greatest evolution wasn't in our genes at all, but in our understanding of what it means to be alive in a cosmos that is far more miraculous than we ever imagined."